Good evening, everybody. This is AJ of the Mighty Glue Stick. How's it going? Today we're going to go back to dragons, and I'm going to cover the rare brown dragon. Brown dragons are related to blue dragons. They're both chromatic dragons, and we've got precedent that brown dragons can be the offspring of blue dragons in Draconis, who was the offspring of Abasagil, who was a blue dragon. They could both turn into humanoids, which is also rare for chromatic dragons, and Draconis he's from Baldur's Gate 2, Throne of Baal, and he could turn invisible in his human form, where he basically spent a lot of time as a unarmed fighter and a powerful mage. And he turned invisible in combat, which was his shtick, but he was killed by adventurers who took his severed head in order to pass into his mother Abasagil's lair. We also have Volpomiscan, who was a brown dragon who dwelt in the citadel of Black Ash in Unther, around minus 300 DR. He's got some interesting parts in that story of that time, in the citadel of Black Ash. So, yeah, lots of enslaved dwarves in that story, so they probably carry that tradition with them if they left that area. And he also fought with Marduk, who slayed him, of course, because Marduk's a god. So brown dragons are interesting in that they are flightless, and they prefer to live in desert environments, high dry sands, or places where lots of ruins. The Anarok Desert is a perfect example. Of course, they don't delve too deeply, otherwise they're liable to run into the Faerun. But anywhere which it's kind of a desiccated, dry terrain which is devoid of humanoids, because they are fairly cunning and retiring for a chromatic dragon, and they prefer to ambush their prey or take easy pickings. Although they do have a taste for exotic meats, they generally dwell in areas where they can subsist mostly on minerals. Dragons, draconic beings, don't necessarily only eat organic material, they also eat inorganic material. They're exotic beings, they're not like mammals or reptiles, they're magical. So they are in various hues of brown. Some of them like to keep their scales quite rough. They have a leathery texture to their scales, which is also a little bit unlike other dragons. And being flightless, they have these sort of fanning frills out each side of their body, a little bit like the gold and silver dragon wings, except they are entirely flightless, and they use it for their ferocious burrowing ability, so they can burrow through rock and sand quite easily. And they prefer to lair with lots of interesting bits and pieces, and they surround themselves with exotic foods and meats and things, stuff that's hard to come by. Their treasure is delicacies of their own preference. They're kind of narcissistic in that way. So they might have crockery and artwork and interesting urns and vases from different civilizations that they sit on their piles of the usual gold and copper and silver gems and other artworks and things. And they admire books of ancient lore or lost histories or accounts, first-hand accounts that they've stolen away to peruse at their leisure. They can live for, the oldest known brown dragon lived for about 2,000 years. Truly ancient brown dragon is usually around 1,200 years or so, give or take a century. Their adult age by 130 and become elders after their 600th year. Wormling stage of brown dragon development lasts for about 8 years. They gestate for 5 months of a 14-month incubation period, and they are generally born in clutches of 5 to 6 eggs, which is an average of 3 hatchlings successfully under optimal conditions, devoid of any sort of other bigger predators in the area or predation by their own siblings or rivals, or, of course, any humanoids in the area. Brown dragons tend to avoid humanoids. They find them troublesome. They've got a long history of being killed by them, so they tend to avoid them these days. However, humanoids do tend to go out of the way places, and they do dig down into lairs and things like that when they go looking for lost ruins and things, which the brown dragons find convenient because they create nice air pocket grottos underneath lots of regolith that they can burrow down into and remain quite comfortable. But of course, interloping adventuring parties coming along, and the brown dragons really don't appreciate that sort of interruption. There aren't a lot of 5th edition stats for them. But I would encourage you to use basically the same stats as blue dragons, except swap out their lightning abilities for sort of sandstormy type of conditions, like a whirlwind of sand or something like that they can use as a lair action. They spit acid, much like a black dragon, and it's also kind of convenient in their dry and deserty home because the acid tends to reduce everything down to sizzling sandy minerals anyway, which the brown dragon can eat on at their leisure. They also love horse flesh, which may compel them to have some interaction with humanoids because humans in particular and elves tend to really like keeping horses. They will also have the occasional diet of dwarf, who goes delving into ruins and things, more so than some other races. They are subterranean generally, but they like to lair close to the surface where they can burrow around in loose soil, not necessarily through deep rock. And they don't go very far away from the sunshine because they like to bask in it in the sort of hot desert conditions anyway. But they have anywhere that's really dry and desolate, and that includes high alpine or also arctic places where you have dry steppes and tundras and things where there's not a lot of water because it remains frozen for a lot of the time. So they can subsist on vegetation and small animals and things like that, and yeah, they just while away their time. But they are evil, they are chromatic, and they're not very nice. So yeah. They're also known as great desert dragons also, and the people who live in the desert areas, such as the Bedine, regard them as being particularly ferocious. Other interesting aspects of them is they have a long face and a rather large jaw. Some of them have a sort of a frill of spines underneath the jaw, sort of projecting forward instead of horns. But they can tuck themselves quite sleek and slither almost like a serpent. And the first thing that you're going to see is them bursting out of the ground because they're ambush predators, as I mentioned, and they'll jump on you from a spray of sand and dust, and they are capable of summoning up a windstorm or such that they can conceal their existence up until the very last minute. So you may be walking through the desert and none the wiser that you're actually walking over a dragon's lair because it's all buried underneath the sand. And there'll be a sandstorm that'll kick up out of nowhere, and next thing you know, this thing's burst out of a sand dune, taken out your horse, dragged it underneath the sand, and there's no trace of it left, and you're left wondering, is this thing going to pop up again? What was it? Where'd that come from? Did it fly out of the sky? You couldn't see because everything was obscured by the sand. But you're in its lair, you're in its environment, and it's going to pick you off one by one. And particularly if some of you get injured, it may actually rile up some of the locals, get some goblins or something like that after your trail. Because if there's conflict and there's easy bodies lying around, that's easy pickings. It doesn't have to risk itself if it's just nabbing up corpses. Or it may take one or two of you back for a torture, particularly if there's a wizard or some such, or a bard, where it can exchange lore and information as it tortures and slowly eats you. So yeah, brown dragons, interesting, good fun.